Hello, my name is Eric Corbett, and my co-author and colleague is Emily Dentone. We are both researchers at Google and the Technology, AI, Society, and Culture team. The title of our paper, Interrogating the T and FAccT, the T standing for transparency, is a critical reflection and analysis of the ways in which FAccT has engaged transparency in its previous scholarship, as well as the ways in which it might engage transparency moving forward. So, as we all know, since its establishment in 2018, FAccT has become the flagship academic community for interdisciplinary scholarship on algorithmic systems. The conference title is composed of a trinity of concepts: fairness, accountability, and transparency that serve to guide the focus and objectives of this community. But of course, in order to use these concepts to interrogate AI, we need to interrogate what they mean to us and how we are using them. While fairness and accountability have been interrogated within FAccT, we don't know much about the value and role of transparency in this community. So how are we engaging transparency, and more importantly, how should we be? To close this gap in understanding, in this paper we interrogated transparency in FAccT using perspectives from critical transparency studies. To do this, we found 26 papers that studied transparency in the previous 4 years of FACT scholarship. Our analysis of these papers centered around 4 questions: what, why, how, and who. So what exactly is being made transparent? Is it an algorithm or a data set, for instance? Why is transparency being pursued? Is it being pursued for accountability, for agency, or for justice? How is transparency being done in the paper? What is the specific mechanism? Is it an interface explanation, a data card, etc.? Who is providing and receiving the transparency? Is it a corporation providing transparency to end user, or a government providing transparency to general publics? And so this is just a bit of what we found in asking these 4 questions. So the majority of the what of transparency is either to make technical components of a system more transparent or make organizational factors more transparent. But few engaged both of these in what we would call a socio-technical approach. In terms of the why, the vast majority of the why is focused on accountability of ML systems. However, most of the papers are presuming transparency will have a positive impact on accountability without evaluating these claims. Third, the how. The papers have a vast overfocus on model explainability as the mechanism for providing transparency. In turn, this feeds into a broader tendency, in fact, to conflate explainability with transparency, which crowds out the creative imagination for other mechanisms. And then fourth and last is the who. So the most common providers are technical experts, for instance, responsible AI researchers or engineers, while end users are frequently imagined as the recipients. But few approaches explicitly provide mechanisms for end users. So one thing that stands out in this is that because the work is not typically human-centered or participatory, power and information asymmetry between recipients and providers are allowed to persist and never really engage in a substantive manner. So this is the what, why, how, and who of transparency. We go much more detail in the paper on these, but for now we want to point out what the broader presumptions about transparency these findings speak to. We found 3 common presumptions precipitated by the current work. For instance, transparency works. It's an effective and useful means to making AI systems more fair and accountable. Second, that transparency is good. Transparency is a normative value. It's good for society, and therefore we need more of it, and it should be pursued as an end in and of itself. And last is that transparency is a peer virtue to fairness and accountability. We should give it equal attention and focus. In the paper, we use perspectives from critical transparency scholarship and academic discourse that interrogates the norms, beliefs, and expectations of transparency in society to challenge these presumptions. So these scholars argue transparency mechanisms often don't work and can be counterproductive to the efforts of those providing it. They argue transparency is not always good. Making something transparent can be good or bad, but there's no inherent moral value in transparency itself. Finally, they would argue that the way in which we treat transparency as a peer to accountability and fairness, again implicitly because it is in the conference's title, is a mistake. Transparency is not a peer to these other two, and thus should not garner the same attention and focus and effort as pursuits of accountability and fairness. In all, the current framing of transparency in fact, or lack thereof, we should say, currently allows transparency to exist as a magical concept, where at times the power of transparency appears to lie in its mere utterance, as if it were a magical formula whose meaning doesn't need to be understood for its effect to be felt. This power, the moral and political capital gained by doing transparency, even when it might be ineffective, immoral, or irrelevant, needs to be critically engaged. So in order to resist this dangerous magic of transparency in the paper, we speculated provocatively whether FACT would be better suited dropping the T from its title. For instance, the ACM Conference on Fairness and Accountability, or even the ACM Conference on Fairness, Accountability, and Explainability, in order to give more focus to our true attention on explainability mechanisms. Ultimately, we argued that we should keep the T, but engage critical perspectives to frame our pursuits of transparency in order to live up to the unique opportunity FACT has to be the premier scholarly community for exploring and providing transparency of AI systems to society. And so to move toward this critical frame, we provided 3 perspectives from critical transparency studies that we think are really important for FACT. First, treating transparency as a political concept. So we have to understand politics are present in both the process and outcome of transparency. Framing transparency as political reminds us that something doesn't just become transparent from nowhere, and that process is really objective. We need to be able to engage who is making something transparent and why. Second, transparency is not always good. There is no inherent moral value in making something more transparent. Transparency is a morally neutral concept. And last, transparency is about people. People matter in transparency. The nature of the relationships, the structures they are embedded in, their agency to be able to reveal or act upon what is revealed. So in addition to those critical perspectives, we point out 3 tangible things that FACT scholars can do with transparency scholarship moving forward. Making transparency contingent, reclaiming transparency from explainability, and bringing people into transparency processes. So, making transparency contingent argues that transparency needs to be situated and evaluated to understand what, if any, value it has in a given context and what other unintended side effects it could have. By making transparency contingent, we are reminded that the value of transparency is not always good, like fairness and accountability. We need to situate it and understand its value rather than presupposing its value. Second, transparency is not explainability. We need to reclaim transparency as a concept from model explainability, which is one particular ways in which transparency might be enacted. Treating explainability as a subset of a much broader array of mechanisms we can use to make AI systems more transparent. Other mechanisms for transparency have been explored, such as documentation, art, public participation. We need to start giving more space and attention to these other potential approaches to create a broad interdisciplinary library. And then finally, we need to start enacting more human-centered and participatory approaches to bring people into transparency processes such that they are empowered to discover the ends and means of transparency that are meaningful to them. In all, the T in fact suggests that we are the premier academic community for exploring the concept of transparency and applying it to society to enable responsible and fair use of AI systems. The thoughts provided in this paper will help FACT move towards this implicit idea of transparency in our title by adopting critical perspectives.